What if I told you that some of the most powerful people in early America never actually held the presidency? That the real decisions, the ones that shaped wars, built political parties, and nearly tore the country apart, were often made by people whose names you've never heard? We obsess over presidents, Washington crossing the Delaware, Lincoln in his top hat, but while presidents were giving speeches and signing documents, there were newspaper editors controlling what people believed, political operatives deciding who even got to run, and wealthy merchants literally funding the government when it ran out of money. For the next couple of hours, we're going to explore the shadow history of early America, the machine bosses, the society wives, the congressional radicals, and the financial titans who wielded power without ever appearing on a ballot. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories of history, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives into the fascinating figures who shaped our world from behind the scenes. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's talk about how power really moved in early America. Starting with a woman who controlled Washington society and saved George Washington's portrait while the city burned around her. Dolley Madison, the Queen of Washington society. So here's the thing about power in early America that nobody really tells you in high school. It wasn't always about who sat in the fancy chair. Sometimes it was about who controlled the guest list. Meet Dolley Madison. You've probably heard her name attached to ice cream, or maybe that one painting she supposedly saved when the British decided to redecorate Washington with fire in 1814. But here's what you need to understand as you're drifting off tonight. Dolley Madison ran the Capitol's social circuit like a benevolent dictator in a turban, and in doing so, she basically invented the job of First Lady as we know it. Picture this. Every Wednesday evening, starting around 1809, when her husband James became president, Dolley would throw what she called squeezes at the White House. Now, these weren't just parties. They were political theater disguised as dessert time. You'd have Federalists and Democratic Republicans, bitter enemies, who'd spent all day hurling insults at each other in Congress, suddenly sharing the same drawing room, nibbling on her famous oyster pie, trying not to spill wine on their silk waistcoats. And Dolley? She worked that room like a maestro, conducting an orchestra of egos. She'd glide between clusters of politicians. Her elaborate turbans towering above the crowd were talking peacock feathers, sometimes making introductions that seemed casual but were absolutely calculated. A whisper here about a pending bill. A gentle nudge there toward a compromise. She had this uncanny ability to make everyone feel like the most important person in the room, even when she was simultaneously playing them like chess pieces. The fascinating part is how she weaponized hospitality. In an era when women couldn't vote or hold office, Dolley created a space where power flowed through social capital instead of legal authority. If you wanted something done in Washington, you needed an invitation to Mrs. Madison's drawing room. Not the president's office, her drawing room. The deals that shaped early American policy? A shocking number of them were born over her Wednesday squeezes, brokered between bites of seed cake and sips of whiskey punch. Now, about that painting. On August 24th, 1814, the British were literally marching toward Washington, and everyone with any sense was fleeing the city. James Madison was off with the troops somewhere, probably regretting several life choices. The White House staff was frantically packing valuables into wagons. And Dolley? She refused to leave until she'd secured Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington. Here's where it gets delightfully specific. She didn't just grab it off the wall. The painting was screwed into the frame, which was screwed into the wall, and nobody had time for proper removal procedures with the British Army breathing down their necks. So Dolley ordered the frame broken, actually broken, and had the canvas cut out and rolled up. She handed it off to two men fleeing the city, with strict instructions to keep it safe. Think about that for a second. The Capitol was burning. Her own safety was in question, and she stopped everything to save a painting of a dead president. But it wasn't really about the painting, was it? It was about symbols. About preserving the image, literally, of American legitimacy. That portrait of Washington represented continuity, authority, the idea that the Republic would survive even if the building didn't. And it did survive. both the painting and the Republic. The White House got rebuilt. Dolley kept hosting her salons for years after James left office. People still sought her advice, her introductions, her blessing on political maneuvers. She died in 1849, having outlived most of her husband's generation, and Congress itself suspended business to attend her funeral. The real power move? She never held an elected position, never gave a formal speech, never signed a single law, but she shaped how Washington worked, the unwritten rules about who mattered, and how things got done in ways that echoed for decades. And while Dolley was perfecting the art of social manipulation in drawing rooms, there was someone else who was doing something similar in a different arena entirely. Someone who understood that real power didn't always come from the presidency, but from knowing exactly how to pull legislative levers and when to refuse to let them go. Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Let me tell you about a man who ran for president 3 times, lost all 3 times, and somehow wielded more power than most of the people who actually won. Henry Clay, born in 1777 in Virginia, died in 1852 in Washington, having spent roughly 40 years making everyone in Congress absolutely exhausted. They called him the Great Compromiser, which sounds admiring until you realize it really meant the guy who wouldn't let anyone get what they wanted, but also wouldn't let the country explode. Once for yen. Yet, somehow, Clay had this ability, and you have to admire the sheer stamina involved to look at situations where half the country wanted one thing and the other half wanted the exact opposite, and engineer a solution that left everyone equally annoyed but still technically united. He did this over and over, like some kind of political Sisyphus, except instead of a boulder, it was the American Republic he kept shoving up the hill. Take the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The question was simple and horrible. Should Missouri enter the Union as a slave state? The North said absolutely not. The South said absolutely yes. Congress was deadlocked. Fistfights were breaking out in the chamber. Actual, physical fistfights between grown men in cravats. And Clay, who was Speaker of the House at the time, basically locked everyone in a room until they agreed to his plan, his solution. And here's the clever bit: slavery is banned in the rest of the Louisiana Territory above the 3630 line. Nobody loved it. Everybody accepted it. The can got kicked down the road for another 30 years. But he wasn't done. In 1833, South Carolina decided it was going to nullify federal tariff laws, essentially announcing that states could just ignore laws they didn't like, which is about as stable a system as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. President Jackson was ready to march troops down there and start a civil war 30 years early. And Clay? He engineered a compromise tariff that gradually reduced rates, giving South Carolina a face-saving way to back down. Then came 1850, which was perhaps Clay's masterpiece of political exhaustion. California wanted to enter as a free state. The South was furious. Congress was paralyzed. Violence in the streets seemed genuinely possible. And Clay, now an old man, 73 years old, seriously ill, barely able to stand for long periods, dragged himself into the Senate and delivered a series of speeches laying out another compromise. California enters free. New Mexico and Utah get to decide for themselves. The slave trade gets banned in Washington, D.C., but slavery itself stays legal there. And, controversially, the fugitive slave law gets strengthened, requiring Northerners to return escaped slaves. The fascinating part is how Clay operated. He didn't just propose compromises and hope for the best. He built coalitions. He traded favors. He made promises and threats in equal measure. He knew every senator's pressure points and wasn't shy about applying pressure. Daniel Webster said Clay had a voice that could charm a bird from a tree, which is a fancy way of saying he was incredibly persuasive when he wanted something. Andrew Jackson, who despised Clay with the burning intensity of 1,000 suns, called him Judas of the West, and accused him of making a corrupt bargain to become Secretary of State in 1825. They had a rivalry that lasted decades and included at least one near duel. Jackson thought Clay was a manipulative schemer who put personal ambition above principle. And you know what? Jackson wasn't entirely wrong. Clay desperately wanted to be president. He ran 3 times, 1824, 1832, 1844, and lost every single time. In 1824, he came in 4th and then threw his support to John Quincy Adams in the House vote, becoming Secretary of State afterward. In 1844, he lost to James Polk by the narrowest of margins, partly because he couldn't take a clear position on Texas annexation without alienating somebody. Here's the irony that might help you sleep. Clay spent his entire career holding the country together through compromise, preventing the Civil War through sheer legislative wizardry and force of personality. And every compromise he made, especially the ones involving slavery, just delayed the inevitable while making the eventual conflict worse. He died in 1852. The Civil War started in 1861. His compromises bought 9 years. But for those years, and for the decades before, Clay was arguably more powerful than the presidents he served with and ran against. He controlled the legislative agenda. He decided which bills lived or died. He built the Whig Party essentially from scratch and kept it functional through sheer willpower. Presidents needed his cooperation to get anything done. The real power, it turned out, wasn't always in the executive mansion. Sometimes it was in the Senate chamber, in the hands of a man who knew exactly how to count votes and when to make deals, even if those deals merely postponed the reckoning to come. And speaking of people who shaped the crisis Clay tried so hard to prevent, there was another figure whose theories about state power and federal authority would echo far beyond his lifetime, providing the intellectual ammunition for the very war Clay's compromises delayed. John C. Calhoun, the nullification architect. All right, settle in, because we need to talk about the man who basically wrote the instruction manual for how to tear a country apart while insisting you're actually trying to save it. John C. Calhoun was born in 1782 in South Carolina, and if you want to understand American history from about 1820 to 1850, you need to understand him. Not because he was right, he wasn't, but because his ideas about state power versus federal authority became the blueprint for secession and eventually the Confederacy itself. Here's what makes Calhoun fascinating in that historical car crash kind of way. He started as a nationalist. Young Calhoun, serving in Congress during the War of 1812, was all about federal power and national unity. He supported tariffs to protect American industry. He wanted federal funding for roads and canals. He was a war hawk, pushing for military action against Britain. The guy was basically a federalist in everything but name. Then something changed. Or rather, Calhoun noticed which way the wind was blowing in his home state and adjusted his sails accordingly. By the 1820s, South Carolina's planter class, the people who actually voted and mattered in state politics, were becoming increasingly paranoid about federal power. Specifically, they worried that the federal government might eventually use its authority to interfere with slavery, and tariffs designed to protect northern manufacturing were making southern agricultural exports more expensive, cutting into plantation profits. So Calhoun, who'd supported those very tariffs years earlier, suddenly discovered that actually, federal tariffs were tyrannical overreach. In 1828, he anonymously wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which laid out the theory of nullification. States could simply void federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Let's pause and appreciate the intellectual gymnastics here. Calhoun's argument went something like this. The Constitution is a compact between sovereign states. Therefore, each state has the right to judge whether federal laws violate that compact. If a state decides a law is unconstitutional, it can nullify it within state borders. And if the federal government tries to enforce the law anyway, well, the state can secede. It was, to put it mildly, constitutional fan fiction. But it was brilliantly argued fan fiction, crafted by a man with a razor-sharp legal mind and absolutely no qualms about where this logic led. The nullification crisis came to a head in 1832. South Carolina, following Calhoun's playbook, declared federal tariff laws null and void within state borders. President Andrew Jackson, who was many things, but indecisive wasn't one of them, responded by threatening to march federal troops into South Carolina and hang Calhoun for treason. Here's a detail that really captures the absurdity. Now, the president was threatening to execute him, and Calhoun was writing speeches explaining why states had the right to ignore the president's authority. Calhoun resigned the vice presidency, the first VP to ever do so, and got himself appointed to the Senate instead, where he could lead the nullification fight directly. The crisis was eventually diffused by Henry Clay's compromise tariff, but Calhoun had made his point. He'd shown Southern states that there was a theoretical framework for resistance, wrapped in constitutional language and defended with lawyer-like precision. For the next 18 years, until his death in 1850, Calhoun served in the Senate as the intellectual leader of the Southern cause. He developed increasingly elaborate theories about concurrent majorities and state sovereignty. He argued that slavery wasn't just economically necessary but positively good. A positive good, he actually called it, defending the institution with arguments that sound monstrous to modern ears but were carefully constructed to appeal to his audience. And here's the thing about Calhoun's power. He never held the presidency. He tried twice, but never got close. He served as vice president twice, but that office had very little real authority. Yet from his Senate seat, he shaped Southern political thought so completely that his ideas became the foundation for Confederate ideology. When Southern states started seceding in 1860 through 61, they cited Calhoun's arguments about state sovereignty. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, considered himself Calhoun's intellectual heir. The Confederate Constitution included provisions that reflected Calhoun's theories about states' rights and limited federal power. Calhoun died in March 1850, 11 years before Fort Sumter, but he saw where everything was heading. His last words, allegedly, were, "The South, the poor South." Whether he was expressing regret or doubling down on his life's work, we'll never know. What we do know is this: Calhoun wielded enormous power through ideas. He gave the South a vocabulary and a constitutional theory for resistance. He made secession seem not like rebellion, but like the logical exercise of state sovereignty. He took regional economic interests and wrapped them in constitutional principle and philosophical argument. The real power wasn't just in the offices he held: vice president, senator, secretary of state. The real power was in the framework he created, the ideas he articulated so persuasively that they outlived him and helped plunge the nation into civil war. And while Calhoun was building his theoretical case for state sovereignty, there was someone else building something equally powerful but far more practical: the political machine that would transform how American politics actually worked, creating structures of party loyalty and organizational control that still shape our system today. Martin Van Buren, the little magician. Let's talk about the man who invented modern politics and did it so smoothly that most people don't even know his name. Martin Van Buren was born in 1782 in Kinderhook, New York. The son of a tavern keeper, and by the time he died in 1862, he'd fundamentally changed how American political parties operated. They called him the Little Magician because he was short, 5 feet 6 inches, and because he had this uncanny ability to make political coalitions appear out of nowhere like rabbits from a hat. But here's what you really need to understand as you're getting drowsy. Van Buren didn't care about the presidency nearly as much as he cared about the machine, the system, the organization that could win elections consistently, regardless of who the candidate was. Before Van Buren, American political parties were basically loose coalitions of elites who agreed on certain principles. They'd argue about policy, run their candidates, and whatever happened, happened. Van Buren looked at that system and thought, what if we actually organized this properly? Starting in the 1820s, Van Buren built something called the Albany Regency in New York, the first true political machine in American history. It worked like this. The Regency controlled state government through a network of loyal office holders. When you won an election, you fired everyone from the previous administration and installed your own people. These people owed their jobs to the party. so they stayed loyal to the party. They also kicked back part of their salaries to fund campaigns. It was the spoils system, formalized and weaponized. To the victor go the spoils, as one of Van Buren's allies put it, and Van Buren didn't apologize for it. He argued that party loyalty and organization were more stable than individual personalities or abstract principles. The Albany Regency also controlled newspapers. Not just influenced them, controlled them. The party would literally buy newspapers or fund friendly editors, ensuring that voters in different regions got the message the party wanted them to receive. It was coordinated political communication decades before anyone used that phrase. Van Buren took this model national. He became a key advisor to Andrew Jackson, helping engineer Jackson's win in 1828. Jackson had the popularity and the personality cult. Van Buren had the organization. Think about what that means. Before Van Buren, parties were philosophical clubs. After Van Buren, they were machines with clear hierarchies, patronage networks, coordinated messaging, and the ability to mobilize voters across entire states. He created the smoke-filled room where deals got made. He invented the political convention as we know it. He established the idea that party loyalty mattered more than personal conviction. And the brilliant part? Van Buren operated mostly behind the scenes. Jackson was the face, Old Hickory, the war hero, the man of the people. Van Buren was the wizard behind the curtain, moving pieces and counting delegates and making sure the right people got the right judgeships at the right times. He served as Jackson's vice president during the second term, then got elected president himself in 1836. And here's where it gets a bit sad. Van Buren was actually a terrible president. He came into office right as the Panic of 1837 crashed the economy. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and Van Buren, committed to Jacksonian principles of limited government, basically did nothing to help. He lost re-election in 1840 in a landslide to William Henry Harrison, who ran on the slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and portrayed Van Buren as an effete aristocrat who drank expensive wine from silver coolers while common folk suffered. The irony? Van Buren came from a working-class background, while Harrison was from Virginia gentry. But here's the thing, and this is important for understanding power in early America. Van Buren's influence didn't end with his presidency. The Democratic Party machine he built kept running. The patronage system he formalized became standard practice. The organizational techniques he pioneered were copied by the Whigs and, eventually, the Republicans. He taught American politics how to be professional. Whether that was good for democracy is a question historians still debate, but there's no debating the impact. Van Buren tried one more time for the presidency in 1848, running as the Free Soil Party candidate opposing slavery's expansion. He lost badly, but possibly cost Democrat Lewis Cass the election by splitting the vote, allowing Whig Zachary Taylor to win. So even in defeat, Van Buren was still moving pieces on the board. He lived until 1862, long enough to see the Civil War start and the party system he'd built fracture along sectional lines, long enough to see the machine prove both its power and its limitations. The real legacy? Van Buren showed that you could wield enormous power without necessarily being president. You could shape American politics fundamentally by building organizations, creating systems, establishing the rules of how the game was played. He was the architect of the political machine, and every boss, every political operative, every campaign manager who came after him was working with tools he'd invented. And speaking of invisible architects, of people who wielded power through organization rather than office, there was another political wizard emerging, just as Van Buren's star was fading. A newspaper editor from upstate New York who would prove that controlling information and party machinery could make you the real power behind multiple governors and even presidents. Thurlow Weed, the Whig wizard. Here's a name you definitely didn't learn in school, and that's exactly how Thurlow Weed wanted it. Born in 1797 in Greene County, New York, died in 1882, having spent most of his life pulling strings so effectively that people called him the Dictator and Lord Thurlow, or at least an acknowledgement of reality. Weed was a newspaper editor. That's what it said on his business card. Anyway, he ran the Albany Evening Journal for decades, turning it into one of the most influential political papers in New York. But calling Thurlow Weed a newspaper editor is like calling Michelangelo a ceiling painter. What Weed actually did was run New York politics for roughly 30 years, from the 1830s through the Civil War. He decided who became governor. He controlled patronage appointments. He rigged conventions and delivered delegates, and made deals in back rooms that shaped national elections. And he did all of this without ever running for office himself. The formula was elegant. Weed would identify a promising politician, someone with charisma, or principles, or military glory, or whatever voters responded to that particular cycle. He'd use his newspaper to build that person up, crafting their public image and controlling their message. He'd use his political machine to deliver actual votes and delegate counts. And then, once his candidate won, Weed would be the person governors and senators consulted on every major decision. His most famous partnership was with William Henry Seward. Weed met Seward in the 1820s, when Seward was a young lawyer. Weed saw potential intelligence, eloquence, ambition. He made Seward governor of New York in 1838. Then, he tried to make him president. Here's where it gets interesting for the power dynamics. Seward was, by all accounts, brilliant, passionate anti-slavery advocate, skilled orator, experienced administrator, but he needed Weed's machine to actually win elections. And Weed needed Seward's talent and principles to give the machine legitimacy and appeal. They called each other Weed and Governor even after Seward left the governorship. They corresponded constantly. Seward would write Weed asking advice on policy positions. Weed would write back explaining the political calculations. It was a partnership, sure, but everyone knew who held the organizational power. In 1860, Weed tried to get Seward the Republican presidential nomination. He had the machine ready. He'd been building support for years. Seward was the frontrunner going into the convention in Chicago. And then Abraham Lincoln, a relative nobody from Illinois with less experience and fewer accomplishments, somehow emerged with the nomination. What happened? Well, Weed got outmaneuvered by Lincoln's team, who made better deals with more delegations. But also, Seward's positions on slavery were considered too radical for a general election. He'd given speeches about irrepressible conflict and higher law that made moderate Republicans nervous. Lincoln was more careful with his language, more acceptable to swing voters. Weed took the loss hard. But, and this shows his political savvy, he pivoted immediately to getting Seward appointed Secretary of State in Lincoln's cabinet. If Weed couldn't control the presidency, he'd settle for controlling the second most powerful position in government. Lincoln, who was nobody's fool, recognized Weed's importance and agreed. Throughout the Civil War, Weed operated as a kind of unofficial advisor and fixer. He used his newspaper network to shore up support for the war effort. He helped manage patronage appointments to keep the Republican coalition together. He raised money and smoothed over conflicts and generally made himself indispensable. The fascinating thing about Weed's power was how it operated through relationships and organization rather than formal authority. He controlled the Whig Party machinery in New York, then helped build the Republican Party when the Whigs collapsed. He had relationships with every newspaper editor who mattered. He knew which local politicians controlled which districts. He understood patronage, who needed a job for their cousin, who wanted a judgeship for their law partner, who could be bought and who could be convinced. He also understood something modern. Campaign consultants rediscover every cycle. Message, discipline matters. Weed's Albany Evening Journal didn't just report news. It shaped narratives. It attacked opponents and defended allies. It coordinated with other friendly papers to amplify certain stories and suppress others. He was doing opposition research and rapid response before those terms existed. By the time Weed died in 1882, the kind of personal machine politics he practiced was already fading. Civil service reform was reducing patronage. Professional journalism was emerging as distinct from party propaganda. But for decades, Thurlow Weed demonstrated that you could be one of the most powerful people in American politics without voters ever casting a ballot for you. You just needed to control information, understand organization, and be smarter about the game than everyone else in the room. The presidency? That was for the public faces, the people voters needed to believe in. Real power. The kind that actually moved legislation and appointed judges and decided who got nominated in the first place, that could live in a newspaper office in Albany, exercised by a man whose name most Americans never knew. Salmon P. Chase. The ambitious Treasury Secretary. You know what's awkward? When your Treasury Secretary is actively campaigning to take your job while simultaneously running the nation's finances from your own cabinet. Welcome to Abraham Lincoln's relationship with Salmon Portland Chase, a man whose ambition was so naked, so persistent, so utterly shameless, that it actually becomes kind of impressive in its own right. Chase was born in 1808 in New Hampshire, and by the time Lincoln appointed him Treasury Secretary in 1861, Chase had already established himself as one of the leading anti-slavery voices in American politics. He'd served as governor of Ohio. He'd been a U.S. senator. He'd defended so many fugitive slaves in court that they called him Attorney General for Runaway Negroes, which he considered a badge of honor, and Chase wanted to be president. Desperately. Intensely. With every fiber of his being. He'd tried for the Republican nomination in 1860 and lost to Lincoln, this rail splitter from Illinois with less governmental experience and fewer anti-slavery credentials. Chase took the loss badly. But when Lincoln offered him the Treasury position, Chase accepted. After all, Treasury Secretary was an important post. Visible, powerful, a great launching pad for another presidential run. Here's what makes Chase fascinating. He was genuinely talented at the job. When the Civil War started, the federal government was basically broke. The economy was in shambles. Lincoln needed money to fight the war, and traditional funding methods weren't going to cut it. Chase invented solutions. He created the first national banking system. He convinced Congress to authorize paper currency, greenbacks, they called them. The first federal paper money since the 1830s. He pushed through the Legal Tender Act, making these new bills valid for all debts. He basically modernized American finance while also, simultaneously plotting to replace his boss. The greenbacks thing deserves a moment. Before Chase, the federal government didn't issue paper money. Private banks did. And it was chaos. Thousands of different designs, varying values, constant counterfeiting. Chase standardized it, putting government authority behind a national currency. It was genuinely innovative policy work. But Chase couldn't help himself. Starting in 1863, even while serving in Lincoln's cabinet, Chase began positioning for the 1864 Republican nomination. His allies started floating his name. Newspapers friendly to Chase began questioning Lincoln's leadership. Chase himself would sit in cabinet meetings, advising on war policy and economic strategy, while his supporters were literally printing campaign materials. The Chase for President movement in 1864 was possibly the most poorly executed political campaign in American history. Someone, probably a Chase supporter who should have thought things through better, published a circular arguing that Lincoln couldn't win re-election and Chase should replace him. The circular was supposed to stay private among Republican insiders. Instead, it leaked to the press. Lincoln read it. The entire cabinet read it. Everyone in Washington read it. And Chase, sitting at the cabinet table, had to pretend he had nothing to do with it, while simultaneously not quite disavowing it either. Lincoln, demonstrating either remarkable patience or strategic brilliance, kept Chase in the cabinet. He needed Chase's financial expertise. The war was still raging. Chase was actually doing good work at Treasury, even if he was also backstabbing his boss in his spare time. But Chase kept pushing. He'd threatened to resign over patronage disputes, thinking Lincoln couldn't afford to lose him. He'd used Treasury Department appointments as leverage for political support. He'd work with radical Republicans in Congress who wanted to push Lincoln toward more aggressive anti-slavery policies. Finally, in June 1864, Chase submitted another resignation threat over an appointment dispute. Lincoln, perhaps finally tired of the drama, or perhaps calculating that Chase had outlived his usefulness, accepted it. Chase was out. The delicious irony? Lincoln won re-election easily in 1864, demolishing the Democratic candidate George McClellan. Chase's prediction that Lincoln couldn't win proved completely wrong. And Chase? He ended up watching from the sidelines as history happened without him. But the story doesn't end there, because Lincoln was nothing if not magnanimous. When Chief Justice Roger Taney died in October 1864, Lincoln appointed Chase to the Supreme Court. Yes, the man who'd spent years trying to undermine him. Lincoln made him Chief Justice. Why? Probably because Chase was genuinely brilliant legally, and Lincoln knew Chase would support Reconstruction and civil rights from the bench. Also possibly because Lincoln found it amusing to give Chase a position he couldn't use as a stepping stone to the presidency. Chase served as Chief Justice until his death in 1873, presiding over important Reconstruction cases and even incredibly making one more half-hearted run at the presidency in 1868, seeking the Democratic nomination despite being a lifelong Republican. He didn't get it. The real power Chase wielded came from his Treasury innovations and his leadership of the radical Republican faction. He pushed Lincoln toward more aggressive emancipation policies. He influenced congressional Republicans through his allies in the Radical Caucus. He shaped Reconstruction policy both from Treasury and later from the Supreme Court. But his presidential ambition, that burning, all-consuming desire to sit in the top chair that never got satisfied, he got close enough to taste it, held positions that touched presidential power, but never quite reached the prize itself. And while Chase was demonstrating how cabinet officials could wield influence by playing factional politics, there was another source of power in Lincoln's White House that operated through even less formal channels, a social network that blurred the lines between personal grief, political influence, and the strange ways power sometimes flows through spaces never intended for politics at all. Mary Todd, Lincoln's salon circle. Here's something that makes historians deeply uncomfortable. We need to talk about Mary Todd Lincoln's seances and what they meant for Civil War policy, which is somehow a real sentence about actual American history. Mary Todd Lincoln was born Mary Ann Todd in 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky, to a wealthy family. She was educated, politically savvy, socially ambitious, and by all accounts, brilliant at reading people and situations. She married Abraham Lincoln in 1842 when he was a struggling lawyer, and she was considered quite a catch, socially speaking. Her family thought she was marrying down. By the time the Lincolns moved into the White House in 1861, Mary had developed what we'd now call a salon, a network of politicians, wives, intellectuals, and social figures who gathered regularly for conversation and, increasingly, for something else entirely. See, the Lincolns lost their son, Willie, to typhoid fever in February 1862. He was 11 years old. The loss devastated both parents. But Mary's grief took a particular form. She became intensely interested in spiritualism, the movement that claimed you could communicate with the dead. Now, before you roll your eyes completely, understand that spiritualism in the 1860s was huge. We're talking mainstream, respectable, with adherents across all social classes. The Civil War was killing hundreds of thousands of young men, and families everywhere were desperate for any connection to lost loved ones. Seances weren't fringe weirdness, they were Victorian grief therapy. Mary held seances in the White House. Actual seances, with mediums and spirit rappings, and attempts to contact Willie. She invited other grieving mothers. She invited politicians and their wives. She invited journalists and intellectuals. And these gatherings became, weirdly, a space where political conversations happened. Here's where it gets complicated and interesting. Mary Todd Lincoln was genuinely politically engaged. She read newspapers constantly. She had opinions about cabinet appointments, military strategy, She was born in Kentucky, a border state, and she had relatives fighting for the Confederacy. Her half-brothers, actually, died fighting for the South. She understood the border state political situation intimately, and she used her social position to influence policy, particularly around appointments and patronage. Mary would host gatherings, not always seances, sometimes just teas or receptions, where she'd advocate for or against certain individuals for government positions. She'd whisper in her husband's ear about who was loyal and who wasn't. She'd cultivate relationships with radical Republicans who wanted more aggressive anti-slavery policies. The evidence suggests she pushed Lincoln toward more radical positions on emancipation. She corresponded with anti-slavery activists. She attended congressional debates on slavery. She made her views known to anyone who'd listen, and as First Lady, plenty of people listened. But here's the uncomfortable part for traditional political history. How much of this influence happened through formal channels versus informal social networks? How much happened in the White House parlor versus the Red Room where Mary held her seances? We know Mary influenced patronage appointments. Lincoln's secretaries John Hay and John Nicolay complained about it constantly in their letters. They called her the Hellcat and blamed her for various political complications. Whether they were being fair or just sexist is debatable, but there's no question Mary involved herself in appointment decisions. We know she advocated for radical Republican policies. Frederick Douglass, after meeting with Mary, noted her strong anti-slavery convictions. She supported Republican politicians who pushed Lincoln toward immediate emancipation rather than gradual, compensated plans. And we know her salons circled the people who attended her gatherings. Whether seances or teas or receptions included influential figures who shaped policy. Senator Charles Sumner was a regular guest. Orville Browning, another senator and Lincoln confidant, attended her events. These weren't just social calls. These were opportunities for political networking and coalition building. The seance aspect is what makes modern people uncomfortable. But in context, it was just another form of social gathering where politics happened. The Victorian era didn't have the same separation between public and private life that we pretend to have now. Politics happened in drawing rooms and at dinner parties. It happened through wives and social networks. Mary's gatherings, seances included, were just an extension of that reality. Did spirits actually attend Mary's seances? Well, no. Did politicians and their wives attend and have political conversations before, during, and after? Absolutely. Did Mary use these gatherings to build influence and push her preferred policies? There's a larger point here about power in the Civil War era. It didn't just flow through formal institutions. It flowed through social networks, through families, through the informal spaces where elites gathered and talked and made deals. Mary Todd Lincoln understood this instinctively and used her position as First Lady to create and manage spaces where these conversations happened. After Lincoln's assassination in 1865, Mary's influence evaporated. She spent years in mourning. Then, in poverty, Congress was stingy with her pension. Then, briefly and controversially, in a sanitarium, after her son Robert had her committed in 1875. She died in 1882, largely forgotten by the political establishment she'd once helped navigate. But for 4 crucial years during the Civil War, Mary Todd Lincoln wielded real influence through her social networks, her political instincts, and yes, her seances. Power doesn't always announce itself through official titles or formal positions. Sometimes it works through whispered conversations in parlor rooms, through social connections and carefully managed gatherings, through the ability to bring the right people together at the right time. And speaking of informal networks wielding formal power, there was an earlier example that set the template for exactly this kind of behind-the-scenes influence. A group of New York politicians who'd perfected the art of party control decades before the Civil War, creating a machine so effective it became the model for political organizations nationwide. The Albany Regency, Van Buren's machine. Let's rewind a bit and talk about where all this machine politics actually started. Because before there were bosses and ward heelers and smoke-filled rooms, there was a group of guys in Albany who basically invented the whole playbook. The Albany Regency. It sounds like a fancy hotel or maybe a mediocre law firm, but it was actually the first modern political machine in American history, operating in New York from roughly 1820 to 1850. And it was Martin Van Buren's masterpiece. Here's how politics worked before the Regency. Wealthy men would run for office based on their personal reputation and maybe some vague ideological principles. They'd give speeches. People would vote. Winners would govern according to their own judgment. It was all very individualistic and very unstable. Van Buren looked at this system and thought it was chaos. What happened when your charismatic leader died or retired? What kept voters loyal? How did you maintain power across election cycles? The answer, Van Buren realized, was organization. The Regency started as a group of Van Buren's political allies who controlled New York state politics. William Marcy, Silas Wright, Benjamin Butler, Azariah Flagg, Edwin Croswell. These weren't just politicians, they were true believers in party discipline and organizational politics. They called themselves bucktails initially, after the deer tails they wore in their hats, as symbols of their Democratic Republican faction. The genius of the Regency was its systematization. They created rules and structures that would survive any individual member. Here's how it worked. Thanks for watching. Thanks like watching wa. First, patronage. When you won an election, every government job from state treasurer down to rural postmaster became a Regency appointment. These people owed their livelihoods to the party, so they stayed loyal to the party. They also contributed money back to party coffers, a percentage of their salary, understood as the price of keeping their jobs. Second, newspapers. The Regency controlled or subsidized newspapers across New York. These papers didn't just report favorably on Regency candidates, they coordinated messaging. If the Regency wanted to attack an opponent or push a particular policy, every friendly newspaper in the state would run similar stories within days. It was coordinated propaganda before anyone used that term. Third, conventions and caucuses. Instead of candidates emerging randomly, the Regency controlled the nomination process. They'd hold conventions where delegates who owed their delegate positions to the Regency would select candidates. This meant the Regency picked who ran, not voters. Democracy, but managed. Fourth, discipline. If you were a Regency member and you broke ranks, supported the wrong candidate, voted wrong on a key issue, you were out. Your patronage dried up. Your newspaper lost funding. Your political career was over. The Regency demanded absolute loyalty to party decisions, even when individual members disagreed. William Marcy, who served as governor and U.S. senator, famously defended the spoils system in 1832. To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy. He was explaining why the Regency fired everyone from the previous administration and installed their own people. It wasn't corruption, Marcy argued, it was how you maintained a functioning political party. The Regency's power reached its peak in the 1830s when Van Buren was vice president and then president. New York was the largest state in the Union, with the most electoral votes. Controlling New York meant controlling national politics, and the Regency controlled New York. But the brilliance was in the structure, not just the control. Van Buren built a machine that could run without him. When he went to Washington, first as senator, then as Secretary of State, then as vice president and president, the Regency kept operating in Albany. Silas Wright became governor. Benjamin Butler became U.S. attorney. The machine replaced its parts and kept running. The Regency also pioneered what we'd now call voter mobilization. They didn't just rely on elite support, they organized voters, local committees in every county, party workers who knew their neighborhoods. Get out the vote efforts on election day. They treated winning elections as a logistical challenge, requiring planning and execution, not just a popularity contest. And they won. Repeatedly. New York went Democratic in presidential election, after presidential election through the 1830s and 40s, delivering its massive electoral vote pile to party candidates. Regency members held Senate seats, House seats, judgeships, everything that mattered, The machine started fragmenting in the 1840s over slavery. Some Regency members supported the barn burner faction that opposed slavery's expansion. Others, the Hunkers, were more conservative. The splits eventually helped doom Van Buren's political career. He ran as the Free Soil candidate in 1848, splitting from the Democratic Party he'd helped build. But the model survived. Tammany Hall, in New York City, borrowed the Regency's techniques. Political machines across the country, in Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, used the Regency as their blueprint. The spoils system became standard federal practice under Andrew Jackson, directly copied from the Regency's state-level operations. Even when progressive reformers in the late 1800s attacked machine politics and pushed for civil service reform, they were fighting systems built on the Regency's foundation. When we talk about political machines or party bosses or smoke-filled rooms, we're talking about descendants of what Van Buren and his allies created in Albany in the 1820s. The real genius was understanding that political power could be institutionalized. You didn't need to be the most charismatic leader or the smartest policy thinker. You needed organization, loyalty, resources, control over nominations and patronage and messaging. Get those right, and you could win elections reliably, regardless of individual candidates' strengths or weaknesses. The Albany Regency demonstrated that in American democracy, the people who controlled party machinery could be more powerful than the elected officials themselves. Governors and senators came and went. The machine remained. And while Van Buren's New York machine was demonstrating the power of organized party discipline, there was another group of political figures who were learning a very different lesson about power specifically. What happens when regions decide that federal authority doesn't apply to them, and how close informal gatherings of discontented elites can bring a young nation to its breaking point. The Hartford Convention delegates. All right, let's talk about one of the strangest, almost disasters in American history. The time a bunch of New England Federalists nearly broke up the country because they were upset about a war, and then got completely humiliated by timing so bad it would be funny if it hadn't almost caused a civil war 40 years early. The Hartford Convention. December 1814 to January 1815. 26 delegates from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Hampshire met secretly in Hartford, Connecticut, ostensibly to discuss their grievances with the War of 1812 and the federal government's handling of it. But here's what everyone suspected they were actually discussing: secession, breaking up the Union, New England going its own way. To understand why this happened, you need to understand how much New England Federalists hated the War of 1812. These were merchants and shippers whose entire economy depended on trade with Britain. President Madison's war cut off that trade completely. British ships blockaded New England ports. Commerce died. The economy crashed. Making it worse, New England Federalists thought the war was stupid and unnecessary. They suspected Southern and Western politicians wanted the war to grab Canadian territory. They saw their sons dying and their businesses failing for what they considered Virginia's imperial ambitions. Some context. The Federalist Party was dying. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans had dominated national politics for over a decade. The Louisiana Purchase had added huge Western territories that would likely become Democratic Republican states. New England Federalists could see their political power evaporating, and they were furious about it. Governor Caleb Strong of Massachusetts called for the convention. He'd previously refused to send state militia to support federal war efforts, claiming states had the right to reject unconstitutional federal demands, a preview of nullification theory that John Calhoun would later develop. The delegates met in secret, which immediately made everyone suspicious. Secrecy plus regional discontent plus wartime usually equals conspiracy. Newspapers speculated wildly about what was happening behind those closed doors. Democratic Republicans accused the Federalists of treason. What actually happened was more complicated. The moderates at the convention, and there were moderates, men like Harrison Gray Otis who wanted to protest without destroying the Union, managed to control the proceedings. Instead of secession, the convention produced a report with proposed constitutional amendments. These amendments were designed to limit Southern and Western power, require a two-thirds congressional majority for declaring war or admitting new states, limit presidents to one term, ban consecutive presidents from the same state, prohibit embargoes lasting more than 60 days. Essentially, the convention wanted to constitutionalize New England's veto power over national policy. The report also hinted darkly at further action if these demands weren't met. It suggested states had the right to interpose themselves between federal authority and their citizens again, previewing nullification. It left open the possibility of another convention if the war continued. 3 commissioners were appointed to deliver these demands to Washington: Harrison Gray Otis, Thomas Lyman, and William Sullivan. They set off in mid-January 1815, probably feeling quite important and justified in their mission, and then everything went spectacularly wrong. While the commissioners were traveling to Washington, 2 pieces of news broke. First, Andrew Jackson had won a decisive victory at the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815, destroying a British invasion force and becoming a national hero overnight. Second, news arrived that American negotiators had signed the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814, ending the war. The commissioners arrived in Washington in mid-February to present their demands, but the war was over. The British were defeated. National mood was jubilant, and here came these New Englanders with their list of complaints and veiled secession threats, looking like fools who'd bet against America right before America won. The timing couldn't have been worse if they'd planned it. They became instantly irrelevant and instantly toxic. No one wanted to hear their grievances. Their proposed amendments went nowhere. The Federalist Party, already struggling, became permanently associated with disloyalty and near treason. The convention destroyed the Federalist Party as a national force. In the 1816 presidential election, Federalist candidate Rufus King won only Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware. By 1820, the Federalists didn't even field a presidential candidate. The party that had helped found the nation, that had given us Washington's cabinet and Hamilton's financial system, died because of the Hartford Convention's spectacularly bad timing. But here's the important part for understanding power in early America. The convention demonstrated that regional interests could threaten the Union itself. It showed that wealthy elites, feeling their power slipping away, might prefer breaking up the country to accepting democratic outcomes they didn't like. The convention also pioneered arguments about state sovereignty and federal overreach that would echo for decades. The idea that states could interpose themselves against federal law. The notion that constitutional amendments could be demanded under threat of secession. The belief that regional interests justified extreme measures. Southern politicians watched and learned. When South Carolina threatened nullification in 1832, they were following the Hartford Convention's playbook. Regional discontent turned into constitutional theory, turned into threats against federal authority. When Southern states actually seceded in 1860 through 61, they cited many of the same principles Hartford delegates had invoked. The Hartford Convention failed, and failed so completely that it destroyed the Federalist Party. But it succeeded in showing how power could flow through regional organizations threatening the Union. It demonstrated that informal gatherings of political elites could shake the foundations of federal authority, even if they couldn't quite bring the building down. And while the Hartford Convention was showing how regional political networks could threaten the Union through formal constitutional arguments, there was another group wielding a different kind of social power in Washington. A network of cabinet wives who would prove that in the 1820s and 30s, personal reputation and social acceptance could literally determine who held power and who didn't. The Petticoat Affair cabinet wives. So here's a question to ponder. As you drift toward sleep, how much power did women wield in early America? Officially, none. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't own property if married. Legally speaking, they were basically furniture. Now, here's the actual answer. In 1829, a group of cabinet wives in Washington nearly brought down Andrew Jackson's presidency. forced multiple cabinet resignations, and completely restructured American government, all through the simple act of refusing to attend social events with one particular woman. Welcome to the Petticoat Affair, which is somehow both the silliest and most consequential political scandal of the Jackson administration. The woman at the center was Margaret Peggy O'Neill Timberlake Eaton, born in 1799. Daughter of a Washington tavern keeper, Peggy grew up around politicians who stayed at her father's establishment. She was, by all accounts, beautiful, vivacious, and comfortable talking with men about politics, which in 1800s, Washington was considered somewhat scandalous behavior for a woman. Peggy married a sailor named John Timberlake. While he was away at sea, which was often, Peggy remained in Washington, living at her father's tavern, socializing with boarders, including Tennessee Senator John Eaton. Rumors spread. Were Peggy and Eaton having an affair? The timeline of events suggested maybe yes, maybe no, but Washington society loves rumors more than facts. John Timberlake died at sea in 1828. Peggy was a widow. John Eaton, by then Jackson's close friend and political ally, married her in January 1829, just months after Timberlake's death. This quick remarriage added fuel to speculation that the affair had started earlier, maybe even that Timberlake's death wasn't as accidental as claimed. Andrew Jackson, having just won the 1828 presidential election, appointed John Eaton as Secretary of War. This made Peggy Eaton a cabinet wife, entitled to attend all the social events that constituted Washington's political scene. And Washington's other cabinet wives said, absolutely not. Floride Calhoun, wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, refused to call on Peggy or receive her at social events. The other cabinet wives followed her lead. They wouldn't invite Peggy to their homes, wouldn't attend events where she'd be present, effectively socially ostracized her. This might seem like petty social drama, except remember, in 1830s Washington, social events were where politics happened. If you couldn't attend dinners and receptions, you couldn't participate in the political conversation. If cabinet wives wouldn't socialize with Peggy, their husbands faced pressure to distance themselves from John Eaton. The social boycott was actually a political attack. Jackson was furious. He'd recently lost his own wife, Rachel, who died just after the 1828 election, partly from stress caused by vicious rumors about her own first marriage's timing. Jackson blamed his political enemies for Rachel's death through their campaign attacks. Now, here were Washington elites attacking another woman's reputation using similar gossip and innuendo. Jackson held cabinet meetings about the Petticoat Affair. Actual cabinet meetings where the president demanded his cabinet members force their wives to socialize with Peggy Eaton. He called Peggy as chaste as a virgin, which is definitely something that got said in formal government proceedings. The cabinet was split. Most members, pressured by their wives and by Washington society, sided against the Eatons. But Martin Van Buren, Jackson's Secretary of State and a widower without a wife to complicate matters, sided with Jackson and made a point of publicly socializing with Peggy. This earned Van Buren enormous credit with Jackson. While other cabinet members were dealing with their wives' social boycotts, Van Buren was attending dinners with the Eatons and demonstrating loyalty. Jackson noticed. The crisis escalated through 1830 and 1831. Cabinet meetings became hostile. Social events turned into battlegrounds of attendance and snubbing. The administration couldn't function because everyone was too busy fighting about whether Peggy Eaton was respectable. Finally, Van Buren proposed a solution. He'd resign as Secretary of State, removing himself from the conflict. Eaton would also resign. This would give Jackson an excuse to request other cabinet resignations and completely reorganize his administration. Jackson agreed. In April 1831, Van Buren and Eaton resigned. Jackson then requested resignations from most of his remaining cabinet. Only Postmaster General William Barry kept his job. It was the first mass cabinet resignation in American history, caused by a dispute over one woman's social acceptability. Jackson reorganized with new cabinet members, ones without wives who'd cause social problems. Van Buren became minister to Britain, though the Senate later rejected his appointment in a move organized by Calhoun. This rejection actually helped Van Buren by making him a martyr. The political consequences were enormous. Calhoun, implicated in the social boycott through his wife's leadership role, saw his relationship with Jackson deteriorate completely. He went from Jackson's chosen successor to his bitter enemy. Van Buren rose to the vice presidency and then the presidency itself in 1836. The cabinet reorganization also allowed Jackson to surround himself with more loyal advisors, his kitchen cabinet of informal counselors, who often had more influence than official cabinet members. So, what was really happening here? On one level, it was exactly what it looked like: social snobbery and sexual double standards. Washington's elite women used the only power they had control over social respectability to enforce their values and exclude someone they deemed unacceptable. On another level, it was political warfare. Calhoun's allies used the Peggy Eaton affair to attack Jackson's cabinet and destabilize his administration. The social boycott was a tool for political ends. And on yet another level, it revealed how gendered power worked in early America. They determined who was respectable and who wasn't. They could make or break careers through social inclusion or exclusion. The Petticoat Affair proved that sometimes the most powerful people in Washington weren't the ones with official titles. Sometimes they were the wives and daughters who ran the drawing rooms where politics actually happened, who decided who got invited and who got cut out, who used social weapons to fight political battles. And while these cabinet wives were demonstrating the power of informal social networks, Jackson was simultaneously building his own informal network of advisors. A kitchen cabinet that would prove you didn't need official government positions to shape presidential policy, just access to the president's ear and his trust. The kitchen cabinet. Jackson's informal advisors. Speaking of people who wielded power without official titles, let's talk about the group that literally gave us the term kitchen cabinet: Andrew Jackson's crew of unofficial advisors who sometimes mattered more than the actual cabinet. Here's what's fascinating. Jackson had a formal cabinet: Secretary of State, Treasury, War, all the proper positions, but he increasingly ignored them in favor of a rotating cast of newspaper editors, old military buddies, and political operatives who'd visit the White House through the back entrance, gather in the kitchen or private quarters, and actually make decisions. The core group included Francis Preston Blair, who edited the Washington Globe newspaper that served as Jackson's propaganda arm. Blair was a Kentucky journalist Jackson brought to Washington specifically to have a loyal press voice. He'd write editorials attacking Jackson's enemies and defending administration policies, but he was also in Jackson's inner circle, helping shape those policies in the first place. Amos Kendall was another newspaper editor turned informal advisor. He'd been editor of the Argus of Western America in Kentucky before Jackson recruited him. Kendall became Jackson's chief speechwriter and political strategist. He drafted Jackson's most important messages, including the veto of the Second Bank Recharter that defined Jackson's presidency. Kendall was so influential that people called him Jackson's thinking machine. Duff Green edited the United States Telegraph and was initially part of the kitchen cabinet until he sided with Calhoun in the split with Jackson. That's how it worked. You were in the inner circle until you weren't, and loyalty was everything. William Berkeley Lewis was Jackson's old friend and campaign manager. He lived in the White House as Jackson's personal guest and advisor. No official position, just constant access to the president's ear. What made the kitchen cabinet powerful was access and trust. These men saw Jackson daily. They ate meals with him. They knew his moods and could time their advice accordingly. Meanwhile, the official cabinet members had to request formal meetings and navigate protocol. The kitchen cabinet's influence peaked during the Bank War of the 1830s. Jackson wanted to destroy the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as a corrupt institution favoring wealthy elites. Treasury Secretary Louis McLean opposed Jackson's bank policy. So did McLean's successor, William Dunn. But the kitchen cabinet unanimously supported destroying the bank. Blair wrote editorials denouncing it. Kendall drafted Jackson's veto message, They encouraged Jackson's instincts and gave him the political ammunition to fight Nicholas Biddle and the bank's supporters. When Jackson decided to remove federal deposits from the bank in 1833, an extremely controversial move, he did it over his Treasury Secretary's objections. Dunn refused to remove the deposits, so Jackson fired him and appointed Roger Taney, who would comply. The kitchen cabinet had helped Jackson make the decision, then helped execute it despite official cabinet opposition. The term kitchen cabinet started as an insult. Jackson's enemies used it to suggest he was ignoring proper governmental channels and taking advice from unqualified cronies. And they weren't entirely wrong. These were newspaper editors and political operatives making major policy decisions. But here's the thing. The kitchen cabinet was effective. They understood public opinion because they shaped it through their newspapers. They understood political communication. They were loyal to Jackson personally, not to their own political ambitions. The formal cabinet included people Jackson had to appoint for political reasons, representing different factions, different regions, different interests. The kitchen cabinet included people Jackson actually trusted and wanted advice from. After Jackson, the concept stuck. Future presidents would have their own informal advisors, people outside the official cabinet who wielded real influence. The term became part of American political vocabulary, describing any group of unofficial advisors with presidential access. The kitchen cabinet demonstrated that, in American democracy, formal structures only tell part of the story. Real power often flows through informal networks of trust and personal loyalty. Sometimes the people making decisions aren't the ones with impressive titles. Sometimes they're the ones who know when to knock on the back door. And while Jackson's kitchen cabinet was demonstrating how informal advisors could wield executive power, there was another group about to show how Congress itself could be dominated by a radical faction willing to override presidential authority entirely, using constitutional mechanisms to reshape the nation according to their vision. The radical Republicans, Stevens, and Sumner. Let me tell you about two men who basically ran the United States for several years, despite never being president, and who proved that Congress, when sufficiently motivated and organized, can completely overwhelm presidential power. Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. One was a representative from Pennsylvania, the other a senator from Massachusetts. Together they led the radical Republicans during and after the Civil War, and they didn't just influence policy, they dictated it, often overriding the president they'd helped elect. Stevens was born in 1792 with a club foot, which he wore as a kind of badge of outsider status his entire life. He became a lawyer in Pennsylvania, defending fugitive slaves and earning a reputation as an abolitionist firebrand. When he entered Congress in 1849, he was already known for taking uncompromising positions. Sumner came from Boston aristocracy, born in 1811, educated at Harvard. But don't let the pedigree fool you. Sumner was as radical as Stevens, maybe more so. In 1856, he gave a speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," attacking slavery supporters so viciously that Representative Preston Brooks beat him nearly to death with a cane on the Senate floor. Sumner took 3 years to recover, and when he returned, he was even more radical. During the Civil War, Stevens and Sumner led the radical Republican faction, pushing Lincoln toward immediate emancipation. They wanted Confederate leaders punished as traitors. They wanted fundamental transformation of Southern society. Lincoln was more cautious, wanting to preserve border state loyalty and moderate Northern support. The radicals pressured him constantly through congressional resolutions, public speeches, and private meetings. They helped push the Emancipation Proclamation from military necessity toward moral imperative. But the radicals' real power emerged after Lincoln's assassination. Andrew Johnson became president, a Tennessee Democrat who'd stayed loyal to the Union, but who had very different ideas about Reconstruction than the radicals did. Johnson wanted quick restoration of Southern states with minimal changes. The radicals wanted complete social revolution, black voting rights, land redistribution, punishment for Confederate leaders, military occupation of the South. The battle was epic. Johnson vetoed radical legislation. The radicals overrode his vetoes, something that rarely happened before but became routine under Johnson. The Freedmen's Bureau Act, Civil Rights Act of 1866, Reconstruction Acts all passed over presidential vetoes. Stevens, as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and later the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, essentially controlled legislation. He decided which bills reached the floor. He negotiated compromises among radical factions. He counted votes and enforced party discipline. Sumner, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a leading voice on Reconstruction, gave the radicals their moral authority and constitutional arguments. He articulated why the South had forfeited its rights through rebellion and why Congress could impose whatever conditions it wanted for readmission. When Johnson continued obstructing radical Reconstruction, they impeached him. Johnson survived by one vote, but his presidency was effectively neutered. He couldn't stop the radicals' agenda. The radicals divided the South into military districts, required new state constitutions with black suffrage, passed the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection and the 15th Amendment protecting voting rights. They reshaped Southern society through federal power in ways unprecedented in American history. Stevens died in 1868, requesting burial in a cemetery that accepted all races. Sumner died in 1874, still fighting for civil rights legislation. The radical Republican movement gradually lost power as Northern whites tired of Reconstruction and Southern whites violently resisted change. But for roughly a decade, Stevens and Sumner demonstrated that Congress could dominate American government if sufficiently unified and determined. They proved that legislative power, exercised aggressively, could override presidential preferences and reshape society according to congressional vision. And their methods overriding vetoes, impeaching the president, using congressional committees to control policy, became part of the congressional toolkit for future power struggles between branches. Yet, even as these legislative radicals were flexing congressional muscle, there was an earlier episode that showed how informal political deals could spark massive political realignments, creating the very conditions that would eventually bring figures like Stevens and Sumner to power. The corrupt bargain brokers, Clay and Adams. Here's a story about how a completely legal, arguably reasonable political deal became known as one of the greatest betrayals in American history and spawned a political movement that reshaped democracy. The election of 1824. 4 candidates, all Democratic Republicans, because the Federalists were basically extinct. Andrew Jackson, war hero and Tennessee Senator. John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State and son of a president. William Crawford, Treasury Secretary. And Henry Clay, Speaker of the House. Jackson won the popular vote with about 41%. Adams got roughly 31%. Crawford and Clay split the rest. But nobody got a majority of electoral votes, so per the 12th Amendment, the election went to the House of Representatives, which would choose from the top 3 candidates. Clay came in 4th, eliminating him. But as Speaker, Clay controlled how the House would vote. His support could decide the presidency. Here's where it gets interesting. Clay and Jackson despised each other. Clay thought Jackson was an unqualified military thug. Jackson thought Clay was a corrupt political operator. Meanwhile, Clay and Adams had policy agreements on internal improvements, tariffs, national banking, the American system Clay had championed. Clay met with Adams. We don't know exactly what they discussed because no one took minutes, which in retrospect was probably a mistake. Shortly after, Clay threw his support to Adams. In February 1825, the House elected Adams president. Several weeks later, Adams appointed Clay as Secretary of State. Jackson lost his mind. Secretary of State was traditionally the stepping stone to the presidency. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams himself had all been Secretary of State first. Clay's appointment looked like payment for delivering the presidency to Adams. Jackson called it a corrupt bargain, a deal where Clay sold his influence for personal advancement. The charge stuck. It didn't matter that Clay's policy preferences aligned with Adams. It didn't matter that House members had legitimate reasons to prefer Adams over Jackson. The optics were terrible. Jackson spent the next 4 years building a political movement around opposition to this alleged corruption. He portrayed himself as the people's candidate, robbed of victory by elite manipulation. Adams and Clay became symbols of corrupt insider politics. The corrupt bargain narrative was brilliantly effective propaganda. It took a complex constitutional process and turned it into a simple story of betrayal. It transformed Jackson from a somewhat scary military figure into a populist hero fighting corrupt elites. Adams's presidency was hobbled from the start. Every initiative faced opposition, framed as more elite corruption. Clay's agenda, internal improvements, protective tariffs got attacked as special interest giveaways. The administration couldn't build popular support because Jackson's movement had poisoned the well. In 1828, Jackson destroyed Adams in the rematch. Popular vote wasn't even close. The corrupt bargain narrative had worked. Jackson rode to the White House on a wave of populist anger at elite political deals. Was there actually a corrupt bargain? Probably not in the sense of an explicit quid pro quo. Clay likely supported Adams for policy reasons, and Adams likely appointed Clay because he was qualified and a valuable ally. But the timing and optics made it look corrupt, and in politics, appearance often matters more than reality. The episode's lasting impact was creating the political culture of Jacksonian democracy, distrust of elites, celebration of common people, suspicion of political deals made behind closed doors. It helped birth the Democratic Party as Jackson's vehicle for popular will against corrupt establishments. Clay never lived it down. Every time he ran for president thereafter, opponents brought up the corrupt bargain. His public service spanning decades got overshadowed by one appointment that looked suspicious. The corrupt bargain also showed how narrative can be more powerful than facts. Jackson lost the 1824 election legitimately according to constitutional rules. But, by controlling the story, by creating a compelling narrative of stolen victory, he turned defeat into a weapon that won him the next election and reshaped American politics for generations. And speaking of institutions that Jackson would later wage war against, there was one that wielded extraordinary power in early America, a private bank that functioned almost as a parallel government, until Jackson decided to destroy it. The second bank directors. Biddle's empire. Imagine if a private bank controlled about 30% of the nation's bank deposits, issued the de facto national currency, regulated state banks through financial pressure, and had its president dining with congressmen and negotiating with the federal government as essentially an equal. Now, imagine the President of the United States deciding this was tyranny and declaring war on the bank. Welcome to the Bank War, starring Nicholas Biddle's Second Bank of the United States versus Andrew Jackson's populist fury. The Second Bank was chartered by Congress in 1816 after the chaos of the War of 1812 showed the need for financial stability. It was a quasi-public institution, privately owned but with a federal charter and some government oversight. The bank held federal deposits, issued banknotes that served as currency, and could regulate other banks by demanding they redeem their notes for specie. Nicholas Biddle became bank president in 1823. He was brilliant, educated in Europe, intellectually sophisticated, basically everything Jackson wasn't. Biddle ran the bank efficiently, stabilizing currency and credit. He also ran it with enormous power and minimal accountability. Here's what bothered Jackson. The bank was enormously powerful, but controlled by private interests. It could create financial crises or prosperity through its lending policies. It could reward political allies and punish enemies. Biddle openly lobbied Congress, made loans to congressmen, used the bank's economic power for political purposes. Jackson saw the bank as a monster, an unelected institution corrupting democracy. He'd also had bad personal experiences with banks earlier in life, losing money to bank failures. He genuinely believed paper currency and banking were inherently corrupting. Biddle made a fatal miscalculation. The bank's charter wasn't set to expire until 1836. But, in 1832, Biddle applied for early recharter, thinking he could pressure Jackson during an election year. Henry Clay, running against Jackson. Jackson vetoed the recharter bill. His veto message was populist fire, attacking the bank as privileging wealthy elites over common farmers and mechanics. It was also constitutionally dubious, but politically brilliant. Jackson won re-election in a landslide, interpreting victory as a mandate to destroy the bank. In 1833, he ordered federal deposits removed from the bank and placed in state banks, pet banks, critics called them. Biddle fought back. He contracted credit, called in loans, deliberately created a financial crisis to prove the economy needed the bank. It was economic warfare. Biddle thought he could force Jackson to back down by demonstrating the bank's necessity. But Jackson wouldn't budge. He called it Biddle's panic, blamed the bank for manipulating the economy, and dug in harder. The public largely supported Jackson, seeing the crisis as proving Jackson's point about the bank's dangerous power. Biddle lost. The bank's charter expired in 1836. It became a state-chartered bank in Pennsylvania and collapsed in 1841. Biddle faced criminal charges for fraud, though he was acquitted before his death in 1844. The bank war revealed competing visions of American power. Biddle represented technocratic management experts running complex institutions for economic stability. Jackson represented democratic accountability, elected leaders controlling economic policy according to popular will, even if economically suboptimal. The consequences were mixed. Without the second bank, currency and credit became chaotic again. State banks issued wildly varying notes. Financial crises in 1837 and 1839 partially resulted from the lack of central banking oversight. But Jackson won the political argument. Americans remained suspicious of concentrated financial power for decades. The United States wouldn't have another central bank until the Federal Reserve in 1913. The bank war showed that even immensely powerful private institutions could be destroyed by determined presidential opposition backed by popular support. Biddle wielded enormous economic power, but Jackson wielded political legitimacy, and ultimately political power trumped economic power. And while the second bank was the most prominent example of private economic power in early America, there were other wealthy individuals whose fortunes were so vast they could essentially function as backup national treasuries when the government needed money. The Mercantile Elite. Let's talk about what happened when the federal government was broke and needed to borrow millions of dollars to fight a war. John Jacob Astor and Stephen Girard were the wealthiest men in America in the early 1800s, and their fortunes were so vast they could literally loan money to the government when Congress couldn't raise funds through normal means. Astor made his fortune in fur trading, building a monopoly on fur from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. His American Fur Company dominated the trade, and Astor reinvested profits into New York real estate. By 1820, he was probably the richest person in America, worth roughly $20 million. Multiply that by several hundred for modern equivalent. Girard was a Philadelphia merchant and banker who'd fled the Haitian Revolution. He made his fortune in shipping and international trade, then bought the first Bank of the United States building when its charter expired in 1811 and ran it as a private bank. When the War of 1812 started, the federal government needed money immediately. The Treasury tried selling bonds, but British blockades and economic disruption made investors nervous. The government couldn't raise sufficient funds through normal channels, so Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin turned to Astor and Girard. Along with a couple other wealthy individuals, they underwrote about $16 million in government war bonds, a huge percentage of total war financing. Think about what this means. Private citizens lending money to the government to fight a war because the government couldn't raise funds otherwise. Astor and Girard were essentially functioning as a central bank, providing liquidity and credit the government couldn't access elsewhere. They made money on the deal, bought bonds below par value, and profited when they were redeemed. But they also took real risk. If the United States lost the war or defaulted, they'd lose millions. Their personal fortunes were backing national survival. This arrangement showed both the limitations of early federal power and the immense concentration of private wealth. The government couldn't raise money from broad populations through taxation or bond sales, so it depended on a handful of merchant princes with enough capital to finance national policy. After the war, both men continued wielding influence. Astor invested heavily in the Second Bank of the United States, serving on its board. Girard's private bank became one of the largest in America, financing trade and infrastructure. When they died, Girard in 1831, Astor in 1848, both left portions of their fortunes to public purposes. Astor left money for the Astor Library in New York, which eventually became part of the New York Public Library. But during their lives, they demonstrated how private wealth could translate into national influence. When the government needed something, loans, financial stability, economic backing, it turned to men like Astor and Girard, giving them enormous informal power over policy. And while these merchant princes wielded economic power, there was another form of influence emerging that would prove equally important in shaping American politics: the power of the press, exercised by newspaper editors who could make or break political careers through editorial decisions and news coverage. The newspaper barons. Greeley and Bennett. Here's something that might help you drift off. Imagine if the most powerful political figures in America weren't elected officials, but newspaper editors who could destroy careers with a single editorial and shape public opinion through what they chose to print or ignore. You don't have to imagine it. That was actually how things worked in the mid-1800s, and two men exemplified this power more than anyone: Horace Greeley and James Gordon Bennett. Greeley founded the New York Tribune in 1841. It became the most influential newspaper in America, especially among Northern readers. Greeley didn't just report news, he shaped it, advocated for causes, and used his editorial page as a political weapon. Bennett founded the New York Herald in 1835, pioneering the penny press model that made newspapers affordable to working-class readers. The Herald focused on sensational stories, crime, scandal, whatever sold papers. These men wielded enormous influence because newspapers were the primary information source for most Americans. If you wanted to know what was happening beyond your town, you read newspapers, and editors decided what you'd read. Greeley was an idealist who championed causes: abolitionism, temperance, labor rights, westward expansion, go west, young man. Though he was actually quoting someone else. He used the Tribune to push the Republican Party toward more radical anti-slavery positions. In the 1850s, Greeley's editorials helped radicalize Northern opinion against slavery. He covered Kansas violence in gruesome detail. He promoted anti-slavery literature. He gave space to abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. The Tribune shaped how hundreds of thousands of Northerners understood the slavery crisis. Greeley also had personal political ambitions. He served briefly in Congress in 1848 through 49. He tried for various nominations. He constantly leveraged his newspaper influence for political positioning. In 1872, he ran for president as a liberal Republican against Ulysses Grant and got demolished. He died shortly after the election, possibly from the stress. Bennett was different, less ideological, more cynical. The Herald covered politics as entertainment and conflict. Bennett would support or attack politicians based on what made good copy, not principle. He pioneered aggressive reporting, sending correspondents to cover wars and scandals. During the Civil War, Bennett's Herald was technically pro-Union but criticized Lincoln constantly. He attacked Lincoln's cautiousness, his cabinet choices, his emancipation timing. The Herald's coverage influenced Northern public opinion about the war's progress. Both editors demonstrated how newspapers could function as political institutions rivaling elected government. They could frame issues, set agendas, attack enemies, promote allies. Politicians courted them, feared them, tried to manipulate them. Lincoln understood this power. He wrote anonymous editorials defending his policies. He tried to manage coverage through strategic information releases, but he couldn't control Greeley or Bennett. They were too independent, too powerful in their own right. The newspaper baron era showed how information control translates into political power. Greeley and Bennett didn't hold office, but they influenced who did. They shaped public opinion on slavery, war, Reconstruction, the defining issues of their era. Their power eventually declined as newspapers multiplied and no single editor could dominate discourse. But for several decades, they proved that controlling the press meant controlling much of the political conversation, making them arguably more influential than many elected officials. And while these northern newspaper barons were shaping public opinion through their presses, there was another group wielding a very different kind of power. Southern planters who controlled not just newspapers and politics, but the entire economic and social structure of half the country through their dominance of slave labor, the planter aristocracy. Let's talk about the group that controlled American politics for decades, despite representing a minority of the population, and how they managed to hold the entire country hostage to protect their economic interests. The Southern planter aristocracy, wealthy slaveholders who dominated Southern politics and wielded enormous influence nationally from the 1790s through 1860. They weren't elected as a bloc. They didn't have an official organization, but they controlled the South's political machinery and used it to protect slavery at all costs. Here's how their power worked. The Constitution counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, giving Southern states more congressional seats and electoral votes than their free population justified. This slave power, as Northern critics called it, meant Southern planters had disproportionate political influence. Southern senators and representatives acted as a unified bloc on slavery issues. They'd vote together, coordinate strategy, block anti-slavery legislation. They controlled committee chairmanships through seniority. They mastered Senate rules to obstruct bills threatening slavery. The planter elite produced most Southern political leaders: Calhoun from South Carolina, Jefferson Davis from Mississippi, Robert Toombs from Georgia, all represented planter interests. They'd been raised in plantation culture, owned slaves themselves, saw slavery as essential to civilization. These men weren't just defending economic interests, though economics mattered enormously. Cotton plantations generated massive wealth, and that wealth depended on slave labor. They also defended a social system where they sat at the top of a rigid hierarchy. Slavery wasn't just about money, it was about power and identity. The planters used their congressional influence to protect slavery through multiple mechanisms. They demanded strict fugitive slave laws, requiring northern states to return escaped slaves. They insisted on slavery's expansion into new territories. In 1850, the compromise that temporarily resolved sectional tensions gave planters a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. Northern states had to cooperate in returning escaped slaves or face federal penalties. It was the planters' price for California entering as a free state. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which let territories decide slavery through popular sovereignty, was pushed by Southern senators led by planters. It overturned the Missouri Compromise and led directly to violence in Kansas. The Dred Scott decision in 1857, declaring that Congress couldn't ban slavery in territories, was influenced by planters' legal arguments and their political pressure on the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger Taney, from a Maryland slaveholding family, wrote the majority opinion, essentially adopting the planters' constitutional theory. What made the planter aristocracy so powerful was their willingness to use extreme measures. They'd block all legislation, appropriations, bills, tariffs, everything until they got slavery protections. They'd threaten disunion constantly. They made slavery non-negotiable. Northern politicians often accommodated these demands because keeping the Union together seemed more important than confronting slavery. Compromise after compromise gave planters much of what they wanted. The planters also controlled information in the South. They owned newspapers, dominated state governments, intimidated dissent. Poor whites who might question slavery's benefits were told that slavery kept them above black people in the social hierarchy. Anti-slavery sentiment was suppressed violently. By the late 1850s, the planter elite had become increasingly radical. The fire-eaters men, like William Lowndes Yancey and Edmund Ruffin, demanded absolute protections for slavery and immediate secession at any threat. They'd concluded that remaining in the Union wasn't worth the political battles over slavery's future. When Lincoln won the 1860 election, despite carrying no Southern states, the planters saw it as proof that Northern numerical superiority would eventually destroy slavery through constitutional means. They chose secession over accepting an anti-slavery president. The planters' power ultimately destroyed them. Their insistence on protecting slavery at all costs made sectional conflict inevitable. Their political dominance of the South meant no alternative voices could emerge. When war came, the system they'd built to protect slavery collapsed. But for decades, they demonstrated how a well-organized minority with unified interests could dominate American politics, shaping national policy despite representing only a fraction of the population. And yet, even as these planters were wielding their slave power to dominate politics, there was a growing movement in the North that would eventually challenge their control, could shift public opinion enough to overcome even entrenched political power. The Abolitionist Network, Garrison and Douglas. So here's a question for your drowsy brain. How do you change a nation's mind about an institution that's been legal for centuries and is protected by the Constitution? Answer: slowly, stubbornly, and by refusing to shut up even when everyone wants you to, which is exactly what the abolitionist movement did, led by figures like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Garrison was a white printer from Massachusetts, born in 1805. In 1831, he started publishing The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper that would run for 34 years. The first issue contained Garrison's famous declaration, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." And he was heard, though not always happily. Garrison was radical, even among abolitionists. He demanded immediate emancipation, with no compensation for slaveholders. He condemned the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, a covenant with death, and an agreement with hell, he called it. He burned copies of the Constitution at public rallies. This made Garrison hugely unpopular, even in the North. Most white Northerners opposed slavery's expansion, but weren't ready for immediate abolition. Garrison was too extreme, too confrontational. Mobs attacked him. Boston elites shunned him. Southern states put bounties on his head. But Garrison kept publishing, kept speaking, kept pushing the moral argument against slavery. The Liberator reached a few thousand subscribers, but influenced many more. Other papers reprinted his editorials. His arguments spread through abolitionist networks. Frederick Douglass came from a very different place. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1818, he escaped in 1838 and became the abolitionist movement's most powerful voice. Douglass had lived slavery. He could describe it from personal experience with an eloquence that devastated pro-slavery arguments. Douglass published his autobiography in 1845, became a celebrated orator, started his own newspaper, the North Star, in 1847. He was brilliant, charismatic, and able to reach audiences Garrison couldn't. White audiences found Douglass compelling because he embodied the humanity slavery denied. Garrison and Douglass worked together initially, with Douglass speaking at events Garrison organized, but they split over tactics in 1850. Garrison believed the Constitution was irredeemably pro-slavery and rejected political action. Douglass came to believe the Constitution could be interpreted as anti-slavery and that political engagement, voting, lobbying, forming anti-slavery parties was essential. The split represented broader tensions in the abolitionist movement: moral suasion versus political action, rejection versus reform, white leadership versus black autonomy. But both approaches contributed to shifting Northern opinion. The Abolitionist Network operated through multiple channels. Newspapers like The Liberator and The North Star spreading arguments, speakers on the lecture circuit describing slavery's horrors, the Underground Railroad helping slaves escape, petition campaigns flooding Congress with anti-slavery demands, political organizing that eventually birthed the Republican Party. They faced enormous resistance. Pro-slavery forces in Congress passed gag rules preventing discussion of anti-slavery petitions from 1836 to 1844. Mobs attacked abolitionists. The federal government prosecuted people helping slaves escape, but the abolitionists persisted, and gradually Northern opinion shifted. Kansas violence in the 1850s radicalized moderates. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, brought anti-slavery arguments to mass audiences. The Fugitive Slave Act forced Northerners to participate in slavery's enforcement, creating moral discomfort. By 1860, enough Northerners opposed slavery's expansion to elect Lincoln on a platform of limiting slavery's growth. The abolitionists hadn't achieved immediate emancipation that required war, but they'd created the moral and political climate, making Republican victory possible. Garrison and Douglas demonstrated how sustained moral arguments could eventually reshape politics. They didn't hold office. They didn't control vast economic resources. But they changed minds, built networks, and refused to accept slavery as permanent, creating space for political transformation. After the Civil War, Garrison retired from activism, considering his work done with slavery's abolition. Douglas continued fighting for civil rights until his death in 1895, recognizing that legal freedom didn't guarantee true equality. The Abolitionist Network proved that determined activists with powerful arguments could challenge entrenched interests and eventually win, even when facing overwhelming institutional opposition. And while these abolitionists were fighting slavery through moral arguments, there was another group using economic arguments to fight political battles: industrialists and their political allies who wanted protective tariffs to build American manufacturing, creating a political struggle that would define party divisions for decades. The Tariff Lobbyists, Clay's American system. Let's talk about how economic policy became the defining political battle of early America, and how a group of manufacturers and their political allies tried to use government power to reshape the American economy. Henry Clay's American system was his grand vision for national development: federal funding for roads and canals to connect markets, and a national bank to stabilize currency and provide credit. Behind this vision stood real economic interests: Northern manufacturers who couldn't compete with British factories without tariff protection, Western farmers who needed better transportation to reach Eastern markets, merchants who wanted stable currency for trade. The tariff issue created the first major sectional economic conflict in American politics. Northern manufacturers wanted high tariffs protecting their industries. Southern planters wanted low tariffs because they exported agricultural goods and bought manufactured products. Tariffs raised prices on what they purchased without helping what they sold. Clay, representing Kentucky, tried to bridge this divide. His American system would help everyone. Manufacturers get protection. Farmers get infrastructure. The South sells cotton to Northern factories instead of exporting it. But the South wasn't buying it. They saw tariffs as Northern manufacturers using federal power to enrich themselves at Southern expense. When Congress passed the Tariff of Abominations in 1828 with extremely high rates, Southern opposition exploded. The tariff lobbyists, manufacturers, and their allied congressmen had real influence in Washington. They'd meet with congressmen, present economic data, make campaign contributions, promise support. It was lobbying as we'd recognize it today, using economic power to influence legislation. The American Iron and Steel Association, formed in 1855, became one of the first organized industry lobbying groups, pushing for tariff protection on iron products. Pennsylvania congressmen, representing a state with major iron interests, reliably supported high tariffs. The textile manufacturers in Massachusetts had similar influence. They'd argue that tariff protections saved American jobs, helped the economy grow, reduced dependence on foreign goods. Their congressmen echoed these arguments on the House floor. This created a persistent political dynamic. Northern industrial states supporting high tariffs, Southern agricultural states opposing them, with shifting coalitions determining outcomes. The Whig Party and later Republicans generally favored protection. Democrats generally favored lower tariffs. The politics got complex because tariffs affected different industries differently. Iron manufacturers wanted protection. Merchants importing foreign goods opposed it. Farmers selling to domestic markets supported it. Farmers exporting crops opposed it. Clay's American system never fully succeeded as an integrated policy. The Second Bank of the United States collapsed in Jackson's Bank War. Internal improvements got blocked by constitutional objections and sectional conflicts. But tariffs remained, creating ongoing political battles. The tariff issue showed how economic interests organized and wielded political power. They invested in political influence, funding candidates, lobbying congressmen, shaping public opinion through friendly newspapers. Southern planters organized similar pressure against tariffs, threatening nullification and secession. The tariff became a proxy for larger debates about federal power and sectional interests. By the Civil War era, tariffs had become partisan. Republicans supported protection as part of their economic development platform, while Democrats favored lower rates. This alignment persisted for decades afterward. The tariff lobbies demonstrated how organized economic interests could shape national policy through sustained political pressure, making them powerful players in American governance even without holding office themselves. And while these northern manufacturers were lobbying for tariffs to build their economic power, there was a growing belief in the North that all of this was part of a larger conspiracy, a shadowy slave power that controlled the federal government and bent all policy to protect and expand slavery, a conspiracy theory that, ironically, helped mobilize political opposition that eventually destroyed slavery itself. The slave power conspiracy theorists. Here's an interesting case where a conspiracy theory was partially true, and believing in it actually changed history. Starting in the 1840s, many Northerners came to believe that a slave power conspiracy controlled the federal government. This wasn't a formal organization, it was supposedly an alliance of Southern planters, Northern sympathizers, and corrupt politicians who conspired to protect and expand slavery regardless of democratic will. The conspiracy theory grew from real observations. Southern politicians did act as a unified bloc on slavery issues. The 3/5 Clause did give Southern states disproportionate power. Pro-slavery forces did dominate the federal government for much of the antebellum period. But the conspiracy theory added a narrative of shadowy coordination and deliberate plotting that went beyond observable politics. It portrayed the slave power as a sinister cabal manipulating events, corrupting institutions, crushing dissent. Evidence cited included the annexation of Texas as a slave state in 1845, supposedly a plot to add slave territory. The Mexican-American War of 1846 through 48, supposedly fought to acquire more slave territory. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, supposedly forcing the North to participate in slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, supposedly opening free territory to slavery through popular sovereignty trickery. Each event had complex causes, but the slave power theory offered a simple explanation. Everything was part of the conspiracy to spread slavery. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 seemed to confirm conspiracy fears. The Supreme Court declared that Congress couldn't ban slavery in territories, that black people had no citizenship rights, that slaveholders could take slaves anywhere. To many Northerners, this looked like the slave power controlling even the judiciary. Republican politicians used slave power rhetoric to mobilize voters. They'd argue that Southern planters threatened Northern free labor, Northern democracy, Northern values. The conspiracy theory made slavery not just a Southern problem, but an existential threat to Northern liberty. Abraham Lincoln employed slave power language in his House Divided speech in 1858, suggesting a design to nationalize slavery. He didn't claim explicit conspiracy, but implied coordinated action toward that end. The conspiracy theory was politically powerful because it explained complex events through simple villainy. It transformed policy disagreements into moral struggles. It made opposing slavery's expansion feel like defending freedom against tyranny. Was there actually a slave power conspiracy? Not in the sense of secret meetings plotting strategy, but there was coordinated action by Southern politicians, protecting shared interests. The line between conspiracy and political coalition gets blurry. The irony is that believing in the slave power conspiracy helped create political will to actually confront slavery. Northern voters mobilized because they thought democracy itself was threatened. When Southern states seceded after Lincoln's election, it seemed to confirm conspiracy theories, the slave power, preferring disunion to accepting democratic outcomes. This strengthened Northern resolve during the Civil War. The slave power conspiracy theory showed how political narratives, even when simplified or exaggerated, can mobilize action. It turned complex political economy into dramatic story, making abstract policy personal and urgent. Whether or not the conspiracy existed precisely as described, Believing in it changed American history by galvanizing opposition that eventually destroyed slavery. And with that thought about how beliefs and narratives can shape power as much as formal institutions, perhaps it's time to let your mind drift, carrying with it the understanding that early American politics was far more complex, far more interesting than any high school textbook suggested, a tangled web of formal and informal power, where senators and society wives, newspaper editors, and wealthy merchants all jockeyed for influence in ways that still echo in how our politics works today. And that brings us to the end of our journey through early America's hidden power brokers, the people who shaped the nation while presidents got the credit and the history books. So the next time someone tells you that understanding American history just means memorizing presidents and their dates, you can smile and remember. Dolley Madison ran Washington through dinner parties. Martin Van Buren invented the political machine. Thurlow Weed decided who became governor without ever running for office himself. And a group of cabinet wives nearly destroyed Andrew Jackson's presidency by refusing to attend tea parties. Power has always been more complicated than the organizational charts suggest. It flows through back rooms and drawing rooms, through newspaper editorials and bank loans, through social networks and political machines. The people who understood that, who knew how to pull those invisible levers, they're the ones who really ran things. So tonight, as you drift off, be grateful you don't have to navigate 1830s Washington social politics just to get anything done. Sleep well, and remember, history is always stranger and more interesting than they taught you in school.